Thank you, Scott. Good afternoon. I am Joshua Houston, General Counsel, Texas Impact. Pleasure to be with you again. What I want to do today, and this is probably how we're going to do it going forward for the next, 3 weeks. Given where we're at in the legislative session, everything's moving very quickly. There are 28 days to go. What I want to do is I want to do a little recap. And today's recap, I'm going to focus on SB 4, the Sanctuary Cities Bill. Then I want to talk a little bit about procedurally where we are at this week in the process and why that's important to what we're asking you to do. And then I want to talk about the bills on the hot list that we think you can be most effective on this week, on this day. And then save plenty of time for Q&A because there's been quite a few bills that we've talked about and I don't want to just forget about them. And if anybody has questions about one they deeply care about, they should just ask me about it. I've got a big kind of master list of everything we've been watching. And then, as always, we actually take requests. So we had somebody have a request to kind of recap SB4, emailed me, and I'm more than happy to do it. So things you might want updates on, feel free to email me and let me know, and I'll try to accommodate that on these next couple Mondays, as things are moving extremely quickly. So in the past Weekly Witness, we spent a lot more time talking about certain policy areas, policies that getting into the nitty gritty details of it, why we're for it, why we're against it, what it means. This is not the time for big policy education. With 28 days to go, patience is short. Most offices only want to know good bill, bad bill. What do you think? Real quick, 90 seconds to make your case. Because they are really feeling the time pressures. Tempers can be short. Animosity kind of grows as the session moves on. The collegiality that was developed early on in session, then it's that people wonder what are members doing in January, February. Why are they going to all these dinners? It's because that collegiality they build in those first couple months has to last. And inevitably, it doesn't last as people's agendas start to die, as things start to happen, people get angry at one another, and that can really have a non-linear effect on your bill that you care about that could be completely unrelated to why somebody is mad at somebody else. So your bill can completely die due to something completely unrelated to the thing that caused the animosity. So let's talk a little bit about SB 4, speaking of animosity that's been built up over the last week. There is an open question how much fallout that's going to have. It's really not known at this time. There is some raw nerves and harsh feelings. The debate went for about 16 hours, went late into the night till about 3 a.m. There were a number of amendments proposed, a couple got adopted, and then there was one big one we're going to talk about. So any amendment that got adopted, with one big exception we're going to talk about, was really just kind of window dressing. They weren't that substantial. They did little things to affect it, generally make it a little better, but they weren't big enough to really deserve talking further about. Many of the amendments that were proposed were never seriously intended to get adopted onto the bill. They were there because they were intended to create an evidence trail for the inevitable litigation that's going to ensue. And then there's the one big amendment that is certainly going to lead to litigation. This was the most important amendment. It's amendment number 9, better known as the Schaefer Amendment. So it cannot be understated, really, the difference between arrest and lawful detention. Now, those are two legal terms of art that I'll try to make plain for you. Arrest requires an evidentiary standard of probable cause. In other words, probable cause is the standard that officers have to meet whenever they go to a court and say, I would like an arrest warrant for so-and-so. Okay, well, state your probable cause, and you have to fill out an affidavit. You have to state the facts that lead you to think that there's probable cause that a crime occurred. This is a very well-litigated standard. They're both pretty well litigated, but this one's a little more black and white. This one is a little more subject to judicial review, at least at the front end, not the back end. And why that's important is because if you're inquiring about someone's immigration status, which is federal, it needs to be, so in other words, nobody would have ever inquired if somebody had not been arrested for a crime, which requires that showing of probable cause. What the Schaefer Amendment did is it went back to the Senate language, which was arrest or lawful detention. What lawful detention is a traffic stop. What lawful detention also is, for those of you who have been to the Capitol, when you walk through the metal detectors, if the machine goes bing, then they will stop you and they will search you further with a wand. At that point, you are detained. You are lawfully detained, because what lawful detention requires is only that the officer be able to state an articulable fact that led to a reasonable suspicion that a crime was occurring. So in other words, what is the articulable fact going through a metal detector? Well, the machine went bing. I mean, that's the fact that is easy to state. So in other words, if you pull somebody over, going through metal detectors, walking down the street, you are lawfully detained at a very easy point. So there were amendments that said you can't do this to children. They were rejected. So this is a very low standard, and that's why people are calling it, and we think rightfully so, a show me your papers bill. Because the status at which somebody can be lawfully detained, oh, I'm sorry, I thought your license plate light was out. Oh, I'm sorry, I thought your registration was out. And then you're able to state that articulable fact that led to your suspicion to detain somebody. It's a very low standard. And so when it comes to inquiring about immigration status, when it comes to fear of law enforcement from the immigrant community, this is a big difference, a very big difference, and why it can't be understated. So let's kind of walk through the process a little bit. That was the policy and where we're at in the process. So to review, the Senate sent over this draconian version with the language of the show me your papers language, this lawful detention language. There was a lot of intent. It was to pass it to the Senate and then use it for primary purposes, to then say, well, look at that liberal House for fixing it. Well, it turns out the House fixed it in committee. The House version went back to that arrest language and took out the lawful detention language. But when it hit the House floor after it had come out of committee, the leadership lost control of it. So when Representative Schaefer proposed this amendment, they spent quite a few hours, 3, 4, 5, I can't remember, but a substantial amount of the debate was spent over this language. The Democrats launched things called points of order to slow the thing up. They tried to propose amendments to the amendments to water it down. There was really nothing they could do, though. When the House lost control of the vote, it went on 81 to 64. And I say that because there were some, why I say lost control is because there were a lot of very high-level defections. So chairmen of committees who were beholden to the speaker for having that chairmanship were more scared of the primary voter than they were inherent ramifications happening in the House chamber. So there were a lot of high-level defections that went and voted for the Schaefer Amendment. They did not want to be exposed to it in a primary. Procedurally, it's now kicked back over to the Senate. So the Senate has, well, they have 3 choices technically, but one they won't do, which is to kill the bill. But the 2 realistic choices is whether or not the Senate decides to concur. So the Senate could just say, we're fine with the House amendments, we concur, and then there's really nothing to do. It goes straight to the governor's office and governor's desk where he's going to sign it. The other option is if the Senate decides to go to conference committee. They could say, we don't like the House's amendments, and we're going to go to conference committee. There's really, if they choose to do that, there's kind of a lot of questions at that point about what happens next. It's very unclear. There's really not, with regard to the Schaefer Amendment, there's nothing to go to conference with. In other words, for that particular division, lawful detention versus arrest. Now both versions say arrest or lawful detention. The lawful detention is in both versions. There's no conflict. And so if there's no conflict in the language, there's really no way to fix it, because the point of conference is to fix the things where the House and Senate disagree. So why that's important is because there's really no way to undo it. You could do a procedure calling going outside the bounds, but that would require both the House and the Senate to vote against a thing they just voted for. In other words, they could vote to go outside the bounds, but if they're doing that, what they're really doing is they're saying, okay, we're now voting against the amendment we just voted for, which was lawful detention. So that seems very highly unlikely. And even if they changed it without going outside the bounds, the Democrats would pop in a point of order. So procedurally, we don't really see a difference between concurrence and conference being that substantial, at least with regard to being able to fix the Schaefer Amendment. It looks like that is the version that's going to go on. Privately, we have heard from reporters that there's some grousing in the Attorney General's office, that it is blatantly unconstitutional, that they're not happy about having to defend it. So there's that. Politically, there's a lot of finger pointing going on right now. That is very, well, finger pointing is really a rumor. So there's a lot of people blaming somebody else for it happening. That's intra-party, within both parties. There's a lot of finger pointing. Between the parties, there's a lot of finger pointing. And so that's why I say, and what I really want to talk about it is the macro narrative of session is what's the fallout going to be? What's the fallout going to be for the next 28 days, especially the next 2 weeks when they're considering House bills in the House before an important House deadline? Politically, I'd say one last thing about that. This is what happens when 95% of the legislature is decided in the primary. It means that both parties are more worried about the March primary than they are about the November general election, which means they are, you could blame them for the way they gerrymander the districts, or you could look in the mirror and reverse that and say this is what happens when only 10% of the state, that's voting, the voting age population, only 10% of the state bothers to show up and vote in the primary. Does that make sense? So very, very low turnout in these primaries. So there's, like I said, a lot of blame to go around.